Legolas is one of the most well-known characters in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as he is a primary member of the Fellowship, and in the films he is iconic for his fight sequences that showcase his elven agility and accuracy. But what if I told you that his most incredible fight was completely removed from the film? Something that I personally think is better than Jackson having him parkour on top of a giant Oliphant while simultaneously wiping out an entire enemy squadron. That's right, in the books, Tolkien writes about a surprise attack that the Fellowship faces on the Anduin River, with a Nazgul riding a fell beast. And who takes this beast on and single-handedly downs it? You guessed it, Legolas. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 17 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I analyze Peter Jackson's adaptations of Tolkien's most iconic series and point out every difference scene by scene. We're almost to the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, and before we discuss the climactic finish to the book, we have to address an entire chapter that Tolkien wrote, but Jackson pretty much glossed over. Today, we are uncovering the Fellowship's journey down the Anduin River to the Falls of Rauros, which was a lot more perilous than the peaceful scenic tour the company takes in the movie. Trust me, today is filled with rocky rapids, orc sneak attacks, and even a Nazgul atop a fell beast. As always, we'll cover every change across the four categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. Today, there aren't any character changes as we only have the Fellowship in this chapter. I guess the Nazgul could count as an extra character, but we'll get to that in the plot changes. Before we dive into our location, timeline, and plot differences though, we first need to cover Peter Jackson's version of this chapter. So let's quickly recap what happens in this scene of the movie, as it's quite brief. Picking up from the Fellowship setting out from Lothlorien, we get a compilation of aerial shots as they paddle down the river in broad daylight and beautiful weather. It really is the calm before the storm and Jackson's adaptation. As they paddle, we cut to a shot in the woods next to the river and suddenly see feet trampling across the ground as a pack of Uruk are on the hunt for the Fellowship. It isn't made super clear, but we get this weird feeling that Legolas and Aragorn are aware of the Uruk and somehow make eye contact with them. I'm not really sure. Finally, after a few seconds of cutting between the Fellowship and the Uruk running through the woods, we cut to nighttime as the Fellowship has stopped to camp for the night. Boromir is staring into the water and notices a log floating near them with glowing eyes. Aragorn says that it is Gollum and he has been following them since Moria. Aragorn mentions that he has tried to lose him, but Gollum is too clever a waterman. Boromir then voices his fear that Gollum might alert the enemy to their whereabouts, and then we cut to Frodo and Sam. Sam, of course, is trying to get Frodo to eat some food, and Frodo refuses. He tells Sam that he cannot help him this time and to get some sleep. We then cut back to Boromir, who is arguing with Aragorn that they should take the path to Minas Tirith, but Aragorn says he wouldn't take the ring within 100 leagues of that city. Then we cut to the next day as they paddle along and come upon the Argonath, after which they then finally get to the end of the river and prepare to make camp along the western shore before crossing at night to continue to Mordor. And that is where the scene ends. Pretty short, right? Well, it's only about 5 minutes in the film, and half of that is just scenic rowing along the river. But per usual, Tolkien wrote an entire chapter about this journey, which, by the way, wasn't just filled with Tolkien-esque descriptions of trees and the sky, but actually action-packed, with an orc attack that gets Frodo shot with an arrow in the shoulder, and Legolas achieving probably the greatest shot ever seen in Middle-earth, thanks to Galadriel's gifted bow. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty plot changes, let's briefly discuss our timeline and location differences, of which there are only a couple. First, for location, there aren't really major changes because Peter Jackson could probably say that he did show us the written locations from the book, but they just weren't outright spoken. However, in the book, we get a rundown of everywhere the Fellowship travels along the river. This includes locations like the Brownlands, Rohan, Emyn Muil, Sarn Gabir, and more. As for timeline, again, this is a blurred line by Peter Jackson, but in the book, they row down the river for 10 days. For the most part, Jackson does an incredible job of showcasing the passage of time and their long journeys throughout the entire trilogy. However, I sort of disagree with this section in particular, mainly because in the book we have multiple sequences that help separate the days for us, like the orc attack, them battling rapids, pouring rain, foggy days, and even at one point having to pick up the boats and walk through the wilderness. In the movie, they pretty much have a peacefully scenic route along the river as if they're on summer vacation. So all of that being said, that is why I include this as a timeline difference, even though Peter Jackson would probably say that they did show 10 days of travel in their cuts. So now let's get into the plot changes, which I've already teased multiple times. As always, if you've watched the series before, you'll know that I can't dive into every single line of of dialogue spoken, as that would take way too long. So if you want to know specifically what they said and slight word discrepancies between the film and the book, go ahead and click the link in my description and claim your free audiobook of The Fellowship of the Ring on Audible. Alright, let's head into the changes. First, I want to give some context for the book's version of events. Tolkien writes that the company takes their time on the river as they are not eager to continue onto the more perilous part of their journey. The river is peaceful for a few days, and Aragorn lets them drift with the current. That is, at least until they get to a spot where there are no trees on the eastern riverbank. Then they hasten forward, not enjoying the feeling of being sitting ducks in the open, as Mordor had taken over much of the eastern land, and orc archers were known to patrol the edge of the river. This is when things start to get more serious, and the peaceful memory of Lothlorien is growing more faint by the day. As they travel, we learn that they are quiet, and no one smiles or laughs or really talks to each other. Each of them are in their own minds. Legolas is thinking of running under the stars during a summer night, Frodo is thinking of the peaceful land of Lothlorien, Gimli was thinking about gold and how he would cast his gift from Galadriel, Merry and Pippin were uncomfortable and ill at ease as Boromir, who was paddling in their boat, was biting his nails and uneasy as well. Plus, Tolkien begins to further reinforce Boromir's mind slowly slipping each day. He writes that one day, Pippin caught a strange gleam in Boromir's eye as he stared at Frodo and stayed close to Aragorn's boat. So all of that being said, it is slightly different from what we get of them just slowly paddling down the river in the movie, as some of these extra details, like their discussion of the surrounding lands and their wariness of orc archers on the eastern bank, are completely removed. Next, the Uruk-hai do chase them to Amon-Hen, which we will cover next week, but for this chapter they are not discussed. Only orcs, led by the Captain Grishnak, are involved in this chapter. Later, these orcs join up with the Uruk-hai and then attack the Fellowship and take Merry and Pippin. But in the movie, they only portray the Fellowship as seeing or somehow knowing of these Uruk-hai, mainly because Celeborn in the movie told Aragorn that they were out there, but in the book, they do not know about the Uruk-hai and only encounter the regular orcs, which we'll discuss momentarily. But before we get to the orc encounter, we need to go over the changes made to Gollum's inclusion in this scene. In the movie, they show Boromir staring into the water and seeing Gollum, but technically in the book, Sam is the first one to see Gollum's log floating behind them in the river. You see, we learn in the book that Sam was cramped and uncomfortable in the boats. Nobody trusted him with a paddle, so he never helped row along, meaning that he just sat there looking out over the water until he would fall asleep. And this is when he thinks he spots Gollum. While he sat there, useless and unhappy, he thought he saw something floating behind them, but after rubbing his eyes, it was gone. After they stop to camp, Sam tells Frodo about what he saw, telling Frodo that he saw a log with bright glowing eyes. Frodo says that he would have disregarded Sam's sight as drowsiness, except for the fact that he himself had been seeing those eyes since Moria. Sam then says that he thinks it's Gollum and says that they must be wary as they might wake up one night with his nasty fingers wringing their necks. This is the beginning of Sam's hate for Gollum, which the movie saves until later on. The next change in regard to Gollum is that he actually has his closest encounter yet with Frodo. If you recall in Lothlorien, he almost got to Frodo, and this time he gets even closer. While they're camping that night on the riverbank, Sam keeps watch for a while and then he wakes Frodo and they swap places. While Frodo is watching, he sees Gollum's eyes only a yard away from him. He gets up and takes out Sting, at which point the lamp-like eyes go out and he hears a splash as if Gollum had dove back into the river. Aragorn then wakes up to this noise and asks Frodo why his sword is out. Frodo tells him that he thinks Gollum was there, and then Aragorn tells him about how he's known Gollum has been tracking them since Moria. He says that he's even tried to catch him once or twice while they've been on the river, but he says Gollum is slyer than a fox and as slippery as a fish. He then tells Frodo to get some sleep, and Aragorn takes the night watch. The movie completely omits this moment and interaction, but there is one consistent thing. Aragorn has known about Gollum following them since Moria. This made me wonder why Aragorn has never said anything before. Especially in the book, Frodo almost feels like he is going crazy because he keeps seeing this creature and hasn't put a name to it yet, only guessing that it is Gollum. And then after weeks of travel, Aragorn is just like, oh yeah, I've known the whole time. This does make sense because Aragorn was the one who hunted and captured Gollum before, so he would be familiar with the creature. However, I find it strange that he didn't alert anyone else until this moment. Anyway, another small moment they changed and added for the film is during that night that they're camping on the riverbank, and Sam asks Frodo to eat something. This dialogue never happens in the book. This is a common theme, and I'm curious to get to the next movie and analyze more of the differences between Sam and Frodo's interactions in the book and movie. Because in the book, Frodo is way more friendly and open to Sam's help. Even having Sam accompany him to the Mirror of Galadriel and Lothlorien shows just how close they are. But in the movie, Frodo is already pushing Sam away and saying, "You can't help me," which is totally different from the book. Next, one day while the sun is setting, Aragorn sees a fell beast. For some context, while they're preparing to set back out on their journey one evening, Aragorn sees a dark flying shape far off in the distance. He then asks Legolas what it is, and Legolas tells him that it looks like a hunting eagle, but notes that it is far from where it should be. What Legolas doesn't know is that this is actually one of the Nazgul riding a fell beast, as it had been summoned by Grishnak, the orc captain that had been tracking the Fellowship. This is such an ominous part of the book, and it, as well as the following attack, is omitted from the movie. I am not sure if they just wanted to save the grandeur of the fell beast for the later films, but I love that Tolkien had this detail. It really showcases how Sauron and Saruman were after the ring at the same time, whereas in the movie, we only really see Saruman's side of things at this point. I know it's obvious that Sauron was constantly after the ring, but in the book, there are actually events that take place and showcase this, not just a general feeling like in the movie. For much of the later part of the Fellowship of the Ring, you get the feeling that Saruman is the real bad guy. And speaking of actual events, we now come to one of the most epic and intense moments in the Fellowship's journey down the Anduin River. First, before I dive into the attack, there's a small change I need to note. They had been traveling mostly under the cover of night during this time, which the movie changed. In the movie, we really only see them during the day in perfect weather, but in the book, they faced rain, fog, and traveled in the dark, which partially led to this horrible situation that we're about to discuss. You see, while going down the river, they nearly die to rocky rapids in the stream, as they couldn't see that far ahead of them. For fear of drowning in the river, they try to paddle backwards against the current, and it is at this moment that they suddenly hear the twang of bowstrings as arrows start flying at them in the dark. While they rush to get out of the treacherous current, one of the arrows even hits Frodo on the shoulder, but thankfully bounces off because of his mithril vest. Finally, after much struggle, they end up escaping because of their Lothlorien boats and the cover of their cloaks, which help make them nearly invisible in the dark. Once they reach the bank on the west side, Legolas jumps out of his boat with his bow and peers into the darkness to find a mark for his arrows. Things quiet down as the orcs seem to be hiding, but suddenly a dark winged figure swoops down at them from the sky, and they can hear the shrill cries from the other side of the river as orcs cheer on the Nazgul that is riding atop the fell beast. At this appearance of the Nazgul, Frodo is struck with sudden pain in his weather-top wound, but thankfully Legolas saves the day as he quickly fires an arrow at the beast, nailing it and causing it to crash down on the east side of the river. They hear cries and curses from the orcs across the way, but eventually the noise dies down and they don't get attacked again as the beast has been defeated. This is one of the coolest moments Legolas has had so far in the book, as he really hasn't had a chance to showcase his skills with the foes they've faced so far. And what makes this even greater is that this foe was none other than a Nazgul, known as some of the most dangerous and powerful beings in Middle-earth under the direct command of Sauron himself. Even Gandalf struggled to face them. But thankfully, their worst enemy so far in the books seems to be rivers, as once Legolas downs the Nazgul's mode of transportation, which was no easy feat by the way, as we all know that you never come between a Nazgul and his prey, the Nazgul is trapped on the eastern shore of the Anduin. So now we come to the aftermath of the attack, which is also omitted from the film. After they wait for the all clear, Aragorn takes them down the stream a little farther until they reach a good camping spot, but they don't light a fire and they simply huddle up in the boats until dawn. At this time, Gimli praises Legolas and the Bow of Galadriel, telling him that it was a mighty shot. Sam then looks at the moon and they begin talking about how much time has passed, as he seems to have lost count since they got to Lothlorien. They then end the conversation with Frodo mentioning that the power of Galadriel's ring helps to keep time from affecting Lothlorien, and Aragorn quickly chastises him for mentioning the ring outside of Lorien, even amongst allies. This brings on another change, as Tolkien does his typical good job of detailing the nights that pass, which brings us to our total 10-day journey. But Jackson crams a lot of these camping moments into one night, as in the movie, Boromir argues with Aragorn about going to Minas Tirith the same night that they spot Gollum. But in the book, he doesn't mention Minas Tirith until the morning after the orc attack. Next, when they wake up the next day to carry on, Aragorn and Legolas actually go ahead to scout the end of the rapids in the river. Once they determine that it's a walkable distance, they then carry their boats on land until they reach the end of the rapids and can get back in the water safely. At this point, Boromir is getting quite upset and crabby, and complains about how carrying the boats would be a tough task even if they all were men. Gimli then says that while the legs of men will lag, the legs of a dwarf will carry on even if they carry twice the weight weight of the dwarf himself. We are getting the feeling that everyone in the Fellowship is getting quite annoyed with Boromir at this point. After moving the boats, they rest and then carry on the next day in the cover of mist and rain. As I mentioned earlier, in the movie we are shown essentially all perfect weather, but in the book they deal with all types of weather. Of course, pouring rain probably would have made filming difficult, but hey, that's the sacrifice you make for accuracy. Finally, the last change we have is a really small one, but it's my job to point out all the differences I notice. So, technically, the statues of the Argonath both hold axes in their right hands. In the movie, we are shown the figure on the left holding an axe, while the figure on the right has a sword. While this looks much cooler for the film, it technically isn't accurate. And that wraps up all the changes for this week's episode. What do you think about this brief travel sequence in the movie? Did you even know about the Orc and Nazgul attack on the river? Personally, I think they must have swapped this moment out for Legolas' solo kill of the Oliphant, but I would have preferred him downing a fell beast instead. Per usual, if you're behind on episodes, be sure to check out the series playlist and catch up with all the videos you've missed so far, as next week we might be on the final episode of the Fellowship of the Ring. That being said, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.